All right, guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this. A Starbucks pumpkin spice latte. No, I'm just kidding. I take my coffee just like I take my rifles, black. What I actually want to talk about is this. A Romanian PSL-54C. All right, now in order to talk about this rifle, we first need to talk about a little bit of history. Now, I'm going to be honest, this history portion is going to be kind of long, so for those of you who don't have the interest or the attention span, I'll go ahead and annotate in the description where the actual review starts up. So, for the rest of you, let's go ahead and cover a little bit of history about this rifle. Now, in 1968, Czechoslovakia was having a bit of a political awakening going on, where the Liberal Party was moving against the authoritarian party and really pushing a more democratic socialist agenda, which was becoming increasingly disturbing to Russia and the rest of the USSR. So finally, especially once it became the possibility that Czechoslovakia may secede from the USSR, which would lose the USSR a vital industrial capability, as well as allowing potential incursion deep into the former Soviet Union's lines from a war heating up potentially with NATO. Russia declared that it wanted to invade and it wanted the help from several of its satellite states. Now, 4 other countries agreed to the invasion because they felt that their capabilities or future was threatened by Czechoslovakia leaving. But 2 countries not only declined the offer to invade, but also publicly denounced the invasion that occurred. Regardless, Russia and 4 other countries wound up sending 500,000 troops into Czechoslovakia, and the interesting thing is that Czechoslovakia actually fought a peaceful revolution. They did not use their military forces or anything like that to resist the invasion. They used protest and demonstrations in order to combat the invaders, which I find to be very interesting. However, it didn't necessarily work out in the regard of being bloodless, because 300 people were killed and 500 injured during the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. Eventually, Czechoslovakia won, but it was kind of a long game, and a lot of people died in the process. Now, eventually, Albania would actually wind up leaving the Soviet Union over this, and Romania would be told by Russia that they could no longer expect to get any technical data packages for military weapons from Russia. Now, what does that mean? And a lot of this, you have to understand how the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact worked. And I really didn't even slightly understand it. And believe me, I'm no geopolitical expert, so don't necessarily take everything I'm saying as gospel or the extent of how things worked. I would definitely suggest that you guys do a little bit more research on this, but I did do a little bit of work in Eastern Europe for a little while, and I picked up a couple of things. Now, as Americans, we have a tendency to think of the former Soviet Union as like everything's Russia, right? And even if you do recognize that there were countries that made up the former Soviet Union, you still have a tendency to think of it all as Russia. Like Lithuania is little Russia, and Poland's like bigger Russia, and Russia's like huge Russia. Not necessarily as those countries as individual countries, which is what they actually were. It was a group of allies connected by political ideology originating out of Russia, who shared resources, economies, and military capabilities across borders. Now, Russia was definitely the most powerful, influential, resource-rich, technologically capable, and manpower capable of all of those collections. They were definitely the head of the overall Warsaw Pact Treaty, but everyone else still had a say in their own personal affairs and all that kind of stuff. Unless you did something they didn't like Czechoslovakia, and then you wound up invaded. But that's why, communism kind of failed in that respect. So, let's say that I'm a country that's entering the Warsaw Pact, so we can get an understanding of just how severe this denial of technical data packages was. Let's say I'm a new country wanting to enter the Warsaw Pact, and I join up, and we're linking our our political and social ideologies and all that kind of stuff. And Russia comes up to me, it's like, hey man, we've got this like military thing going on where we all have pretty similar stuff, so we need to make sure that you're on the same level. So we've got our beginners pack here where we can give you a bunch of our surplus weapons like, SKSs, PPSH-41s, Tokarev pistols, RPD machine guns. Is that something that would interest you? Are you like a Lithuania where you don't have a lot of industrial capability or military production going on, and you need like a little leg up on some equipment? And I'm like, no. I have an industrial capability. I can produce weapons. I don't need your leftovers. And Russia's like, okay, so you want the advanced package, right? Where we'll give you our latest technical data packages and the rights to produce them, and you can use your factories to produce AKMs, RPKs, Makarov pistols, all that kind of stuff. Is that what you want? Are you more like a Poland and Romania, Eastern Germany, and all that kind of stuff? You have facilities and you want to produce our weapons, out of your own facilities. And I'm like, No. Your current production weapons don't meet my tactical doctrine or are an affront to my cultural identity. And Russia's like, oh, so you're more like a Yugoslavia or a Czechoslovakia where you just want to produce your own weapon systems and we'll allow you as long as they conform to our standards. That one. That's the one I want. And Yugoslavia did so because of tactics and techniques where they needed to produce their weapons in a specific manner. And Czechoslovakia, I swear, produced their own weapon systems purely to thumb their nose at the rest of the Soviet Union, because their stuff was just different enough that like parts wouldn't interchange. But it was all the same caliber because, well, Russia made them. Anyway, back to the actual story here. So when this went down and Romania got told that, hey, get bent, you're not getting any more of our technical data packages, it did so at a time where they already had like the AKM and a lot of those other types of weapon systems, stuff that they'd already purchased the rights to produce, they could keep on producing. But they were still missing some small arms advancements that by the 1970s they were wanting to take a closer look at, and that was in the designated rifle, or the designated marksman's rifle capability. Now in 1963, the Dragunov came out. However, apparently, Romania drug its feet on getting the technical data package for that, so whatever it was using for a designated marksman's rifle at the time was not up to that standard. If I had to take a guess, they were either most likely using Mosin Nagants or maybe SVT-40s and possibly SKS rifles, but regardless, they were not using anything that was actually like technologically advanced for the time. It wasn't semi-automatic. And now, of course, in a designated marksman's rifle, you don't necessarily want an intermediate cartridge, at least not when you're trying to push it out to range, as much as you want a full power cartridge like what for the Soviet Union would have been the 7.62 by 5.4. So, now that Romania has identified this deficiency, they start working on their own semi-automatic 7.62 by 5.4 chamber designated marksman's rifle. And what they wind up doing is taking an AK-47 and more or less stretching it out and chambering it in 7.62 by 5.4. Now, a lot of experts like to claim that the PSL is an elongated RPK because it has the bulge trunnion. However, an RPK is an elongated AK-47, well, not an elongated AK-47, but it's an AK-47 with a bulge trunnion and a longer, heavier barrel. So, ipso facto, a PSL is an elongated AK-47. Just throwing that out there. I'm not saying that they're wrong, I'm just saying that I'm looking at it from a slightly different point of view, and I'm still kind of right. Now, a lot of people like to say that the PSL and the Dragunov are related, and I'm here to tell you that that is not true. And as we go through the individual parts of this rifle, we will... I mean, I wish I had a Dragunov to compare it to, but wow, that's expensive and hard to find. So I'll have to roll in pictures of parts of the Dragunov, but we will break down how these rifles are not at all related, that at best they meet each other in form factor, kind of like how this is related to an AK. More so in form factor than it is in parts. I mean, it's an elongated AK, and it functions the same as an AK, which at least leaves those two things linked, but a Dragunov functions completely differently. All right, so Now, I mean, this rifle hits the market, and it also, of course, winds up getting exported and stuff like that. And you wind up seeing it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Sinai, Yemen, all the Middle Eastern hotspots the PSL has shown up in. Now, eventually, the Soviet Union would fall, and we would start getting the former Soviet Union rifles on the commercial market. And this came imported under a number of different names, including, let's see, the Romac 3, which I'm not sure what a Romac 1 or 2 was, the FPK Dragunov, which further bolsters the common mistaken identity between a Dragunov and a PSL, and the SSG-97, which I have no idea why anyone would call this an SSG-97. This has absolutely nothing in common with any other SSG on the entire market. I don't know why you would do that, but somebody did. And then the PSL-54C. Now, this has also been imported in a couple of different bursts where like a lot of rifles would reach our shores. And every time it happens, the price goes up. First, these rifles used to come in for about $800. Now they're coming in for about $2,200. Now, I did not pay near that much for this rifle, but I definitely paid more than $800 for it. All right, guys. Well, that pretty much brings us up to date on the history of this rifle. So let's go ahead and welcome back everybody who skipped ahead, and let's start talking about the individual features of this rifle. Now, this is chambered in 7.62 by 5.4. This is a 24.5-inch cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel with a 2-inch muzzle brake here on the end of it. Now, generally, you guys have heard me complain about muzzle brakes. I can't stand them. I don't like them. However, I have no issue with this. It is loud, but it doesn't focus any of the pressure back in a direction to where I feel it in like my nasal cavity, which is what I absolutely hate about most of the muzzle brakes that people seem to use. Pretty much every time I take this to the range, whoever's next to me, informs me that this rifle is very loud. And actually, one time, a buddy of mine were out on a range, and we wound up shooting on either side of a guy just trying to shoot his M&P 15. And my buddy had a braked 300 Win Mag, and I had this, and that guy left shortly after we started shooting, and I'm pretty sure we turned his brain into jelly, which, sorry, bro. It was not on purpose, I promise you that. Now, this is 14 by 1 thread, so this will take any of your standard Soviet bloc type muzzle devices. We do have an AK style front sight, which is adjustable for windage and elevation. We also have a bayonet leg. However, the sides of it have been shaven for import purposes. Let's see, we do have the normal AK long stroke gas piston setup and normal AK type furniture. However, once again, it is long. We do have an AK style tangent rear sight hanging out right there. Now, this optic, these have come in with a couple of different optics, and honestly, any optic with this type of rail attachment setup will attach to this AK style side rail mount, which the AK style side rail mount, as far as AKs are concerned, is the superior mount because the top cover wobbles on AK-47s. So it's not exactly the best mounting point, especially if you're trying to have a scope, something that actually requires a little bit of precision mounted to it. Now, this is the LPS 4x24mm tip 2 optic, which originally would have come with tritium inserts in the reticle. However, they have since burnt out and you can't get new ones. And actually, a lot of the importers for these rifles will pretty much tell you that they do not guarantee that the reticles will light up. There's also a scope out there that has a battery compartment for an illuminated reticle, and even on those, the importers will tell you that they do not guarantee, they do not check to see whether or not those scopes actually function. So all they're guaranteeing is that you're going to have a reticle. Whether or not it's illuminated, a whole nother conversation. Now, we do have adjustable turrets for distance in addition to where we do our zeroing, which we'll talk about that more here in a little bit because it is it is definitely a little difficult. We have a rubber piece mounted here on the end, which also has a yellow film set inside of it, which is supposed to detect active IR. So if you had someone out there with an IR flood of some sort, you would be able to pick that up with this film. Now, it will not work on MVGs, however, just so you know. Now, we also have an extendable sunshade on the front of the optic, and the reticle on this is actually quite interesting. It has hash marks for both windage and some bullet drop compensation in it, and it also has a scale set into the left side of the reticle so that you can estimate distance. Now that scale is calibrated to the average Eurasian male, which is about 5'8", and off of that you're supposed to be able to take a quick guesstimate on how far somebody is, and then either make your turret adjustments or run off of your bullet drop compensation in order to be able to make the shot. And I love that. I absolutely love something that gives me enough data to be able to quickly, on the fly, with a designated marksman's rifle, because that's what this is, estimate the shot and then be able to adjust from there. Like, that's, you know, see the splash or whatever it may be, follow the trace, and then be able to make my adjustment from there. This is not a precision sniper rifle. This is a designated marksman's rifle, and that's meant for that rapid combat application of fires to be able to extend the capabilities of a squad. That's what this is for. And really, truly, the reticle is very simple. It is a very simple setup. It's something that you could definitely take your average infantryman who's only ever shot iron sights on an AK. Turns out he's the best shot in the squad, so you go ahead, you hand him this rifle, he spends a little bit of time with this reticle, and next thing you know, he's up in combat effective and extending the capabilities of the squad. And also, with those distance guesstimations that you can make with this optic, you can also do things like call for fire and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. It's an interesting application of this reticle. Now, you can also take this scope off, which, I mean, you can run PSO1s on this if you wanted to, anything that'll integrate with this mount. And then you can also get other mounts that will clip into this, but it'll have a Picatinny rail, like perhaps the RS Regulate, or whatever type of side mount Picatinny rail system you'd like to use, so that way you can run red dots if you wanted to for some reason, or also normal scopes, you know, whatever brand it is that you like to run on your rifles. Now, we do have a standard AK safety. This is a stamped receiver. We do have a bulged trunnion, as you can see there. And of course, we have our Rock and Lock magazine system. This is one of the first differences we're going to talk about from a Dragunov, and that is the magazine. So Dragunov magazines are a waffle type magazine. This is a ribbed style magazine with an X crosshatch, which is how you can always tell a PSL mag from anything else. And these magazines are not interchangeable with a Dragunov. Now also, a Dragunov has a slightly different handguard, which you don't notice at first glance, but if you really look at it, you start to notice that's a little different. Now, something this rifle has that pretty much no other AK has out on the market is last shot hold open. It's amazing. I love it. It's one of my favorite things about this rifle. Now, we also have a Tapco G2 aftermarket trigger placed into this. That's very common in order to be able to meet import standards on AKs and stuff like that. Now, the great thing about the side mount system on AKs is that it's completely repeatable. You will not lose zero. Now, let's take a quick look inside of this thing so we can talk about a couple of things that make this rifle very individual. So, this is the piston system out of a Galil Ace as compared to the PSL-54. You can see that there is a massive difference in the length of this piston system. Now, this is another difference between it and a Dragunov, is that a Dragunov uses a completely different gas piston system. It uses a short stroke gas piston system. This uses a long stroke, and long is most definitely in the name. Like, we got a little bit of envy going on right here. Now, in addition to that, the bolt is also different on the PSL from an AK style bolt, as well as from a Dragunov. Dragunov also has a different bolt type setup. So, there are a lot of our internal differences between a Dragunov, an AK, and a PSL. Now that Tapco G2 is a, before I close this up, I'll go ahead and show you guys, is a single hook trigger. And I've got to say, I have no complaints about the Tapco trigger. I actually think it's completely fine. I've never had any issues with that. I have always found the trigger brake to be crisp and the pull light, but of course I'm also not exactly what you would call a trigger snob to begin with. So I'm probably not the person to ask about how good the trigger is on a PSL. Oh, come on now. There we go. All right, so let's come back here to our stock. Now we have a thumb hole stock, which also has a pretty substantial cheek piece. However, I have found a lot of the time when shooting that I still feel like I have more of a chin weld with this rifle, and that it's very tenuous. I almost feel like I'm turning my head sideways because I have a fairly narrow face as it is. So I feel like I need to add some like foam or something right here in order to build up that cheek piece and not feel like I'm floating in space whenever it is that I shoot this. Now, of course, we have a leather sling attached to the rifle, and then also we have this metal butt plate which actually has a spring set into it, which is supposed to help reduce recoil, which is pretty interesting. Now, when I bought this rifle, it came with a couple of things. It came with 2 magazines, which I purchased a third, which, just so you know, these are about $100 a pop, so wow. And then it also came with this pouch, all right, where you can fit your magazines, you could fit your scope down into it, and this pouch came with a cleaning kit, an additional bolt, which we will talk about here in a little bit, as well as an additional stock set. Now, originally this stock set was on the rifle. I actually took these off and put the normal stock set on. If I have to be 100% honest, I hate the stock set. Specifically this cheek riser here, which was probably really great for somebody else, but I noticed every time I put my cheek to it, like I would come away with this burning sensation on my skin, and I'm pretty sure that this is somehow concentrated cancer, and I don't want to use it anymore. So I stopped. And then I also got like a little over 200 rounds of ammunition, because every time somebody sells a 7.62 by 5.4 rifle, they also sell all the ammunition with it. Now that we talked about the features, how does it shoot?
Is that magnification? No. Well, supposed to be what? 3, something like that.
All right, guys, so this thing is an absolute blast to take to the range. However, there's a couple things that we got to talk about, and that is its accuracy. So this is a roughly 3 MOA rifle. I think the best group I've gotten out of it's about 1.5 to 2 MOA. This is not some sort of super precision rifle. It is a designated marksman's rifle. It's supposed to be just taking a rifleman and making him a little more applicable at distance. That's all. This is not supposed to turn every man into a sniper. Okay, that's not reality. So roughly 3 MOA, but as far as ranging and everything like that off the reticle or turning the turrets to whatever distance it is that you're using, everything is simple, crisp, easy. It's an absolute joy to take to the range. Now, let's talk about these turrets. Now, as you see here, I have 2 screws set into the top of each of these turrets, and you loosen those so that you can actually make your zeroing adjustments to the rifle. Here's the thing. First off, those zeroing adjustments, there's no clicks. So I'm sure there's some manual out there that's supposed to tell you how it is that you make these adjustments, but I have no idea where it is. So I wound up just kind of estimating based off of turns how far things were, and actually surprisingly I was generally pretty on it, like guesstimating, oh, I need to adjust 3 inches high, and I'd figure it out. But when it comes to figuring out, so you also notice that we have some markings, and those are in Romanian, and guess what, I don't speak. So pretty much every time I take this to the range, I got to figure out what sus, sol, dripta, and stinga mean. I don't even know if I'm saying those right, but regardless, I got to figure out what those mean, and they have arrows, and I don't know if they're talking about impact or reticle movement, or what it is, what it is that I'm actually moving whenever I do it. So it's kind of a guessing game every time I adjust it. Now, next thing, whenever it is that you tighten those adjustments back up, you also have to make sure that as you turn the screwdriver, you didn't move your turret, because then that really messes up your day with trying to zero the rifle, because it turns out that when you were originally zeroing for 100, you tightened up the screws and you turned to 200, and then let alone have that happen to your windage. But once I got that figured out, which was quite a bit of ammunition, I might add, once I got that figured out, actually playing around with the scope at distance, which I've only been able to run it out to 400, has been easy. Quick adjustments, all that kind of stuff. But now let's talk about ammunition selection. So, in the back here, we actually have some receiver bolstering metal added to it. And that is because with that extremely long bolt that I showed you, this thing picks up some energy. It's overgassed to begin with, and then you have all this reciprocating mass coming to the back of the receiver and stopping. And it is not unusual to either mess up your receiver or crack your bolts, especially if you start running heavier grained ammunition, which is unfortunate because I zeroed this around 180 grain load, which it was a soft point load, and I had a little bit of a hitch in its step whenever I would chamber the first round, but that was a very easy drive that charging handle forward, straight in the battery, and it was good to go. And that was also coincidentally when I got my around 2-inch group out of this rifle, which was with 180 grain ammunition. And I have a couple more rounds of 180, like another box of 180 lying around, a couple of boxes of 174, and baggies full of 203 grain ammunition, none of which should be run in this rifle. Now, there is an adjustable gas block that is made for this rifle in order to be able to use that heavier weighted ammunition, because if you run heavyweight in this when you already have a heavy reciprocating mass, you're just going to beat the rifle to death. So that is something that you have to take into consideration with this rifle. All right, so what do I use this rifle for? Well, this rifle, as far as my self-defense or life and liberty guns are concerned, this is my only designated marksman's rifle that I have. And though it's not necessarily my go-to option, I would prefer something with more AR-15 type handling, like an AR-10. I've got to say I don't feel unarmed with it in that regard. I feel like I can definitely employ this in a designated marksman's type environment. It is that simple, it's that easy, it is that capable overall. However, turns out it's a lot easier to look through it when you take off the scope cover. However, I would still prefer something more like an AR-10, and it's on my to-do list. Now, as a home defense gun, not for inside threats, and definitely not in a suburban environment. The 7.62 by 5.4 is more or less a Russian 30-06, and it's going to punch right through somebody, and that's going to be an issue for the neighbors. But from outside threats, or perhaps if you lived in a place where you were concerned about predators, this wouldn't be a terrible option. I have considered using it as a hunting rifle. I'm not going to be able to this year, but I'm hoping next year to get it out in the woods and maybe take a few deer with it. However, I'm either going to have to take the risk of breaking it with heavier grain ammunition, which shouldn't be an issue in a hunting type setting, or I'm going to have to find some 147 grain soft points. Either or here. Yeah, as far as like a hard use or defensive type rifle, it's not my first choice, but it's not my last choice either. So it's got that going for it. I mean, it's better than a bolt action rifle pretty much any day of the week. Now, what do I suggest you use this for? And what's my ultimate use? I should really go ahead and address what my ultimate use for this rifle is. This is a part of my militaria collection. I love collecting military surplus rifles. I love collecting, in this case, stand-in military surplus rifles. Now, why do I call this a stand-in? That is because this receiver was actually specifically produced for the commercial market. And that is because the original PSL receiver has a third hole. Has a third pinhole. And that third pinhole is in order to incorporate a safety feature to keep the gun from firing out of battery. However, the ATF didn't like that it had a third pinhole, and they made the Cougar arsenal remove it, which means that you don't have the out-of-battery safety. Now, is it that big of an issue? No, I've not heard of these rifles exploding, and I mean, you have to put a lot of rounds through it in order to have a headspace issue to even cause that to begin with. It's really not a concern. However, it's annoying that an erroneous and superfluous reason gave you a technically less safe firearm in the name of trying to make things safe. Like it doesn't make any sense, and it's ridiculous overall. But yes, this is an example of a Romanian military rifle in my overall collection, and that makes me smile. That definitely makes it happy. Every time people come into my gun room and they see this rifle, I get oohs and ahs over it because it is just that interesting. Now, what do I recommend that you use it for? Well, again, with an adjustable gas block, I think you can get a lot of purpose out of this rifle. Especially if you wanted to use it as your DMR entry or your DMR capability, you would get a lot of purpose out of this rifle with an adjustable gas block. I won't do it because it would disrupt the historical aspect of the rifle to me, but you may not be constricted in that same manner. I still think an AR-10 beats it out in a lot of those aspects, but you would not be unarmed with this for that capability. Again, I think it'd be really interesting to see it be used for hunting. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And I mean, of course, a collector, pride of ownership and stuff like that. This has a ton of personality to it, and you just can't deny that. Now, for $2,200, it better have a lot of personality. That's how much these are going for now, but it's a conversation starter pretty much everywhere you go. You take this to a shooting range, it's a conversation starter. If you were to show up to this at a class of some sort, it'd be a conversation starter. So, pride of ownership in spades, and it also happens to be somewhat practical. Rock and lock magazines are kind of an issue, and the cool guy AK reload's not nearly as applicable in this, so it winds up being a bit of an involved affair, but you shouldn't necessarily be CQBing with this rifle. That's not what it's built for. It's entirely too long for that, first off, but it's definitely not its intended purpose. Alright guys, I think that pretty much sums up my thoughts on this particular rifle. I hope you found this informative and helpful, and I think I'll send us out on a little bit of shooting footage. Have a good day.